Hey, what's happening YouTube? Rod J here. I'm going to actually do something a little bit different. I was actually asked by a friend about some of the basics about beer. He's like, you should put something maybe out there together for something that can be easily understood. So I said, well, let me see what I can come up with. Decided to put together a little presentation to help him understand beer a little bit better, and just thought I'd share it here on YouTube as well. So this is something I call beer basics, kind of just going through beer, what makes beer, how beer is actually created, and kind of giving a little bit more of a background in that type of area. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and move forward here. So when you're dealing with the making of beer, right, and what it actually takes to make a beer, there are 4 basic essentials that all beers will usually have. You deal with things like the water, obviously, is a big factor. You also have to have a starch source. So, commonly nowadays it's more the malted barley. Some use rice, some use corn, as we know. But you have to have something of that starch from which the sugar is drawn to be fermented. And that's actually handled by the yeast. So, depending on what type of yeast you use, that gets in there, eats the sugars, and that leads to the fermentation and the creation of the beer. And then you have the flavoring aspect, where you're dealing commonly with hops. Some companies use things like adjuncts, different type of liquids or spices, or you can have things where fruit and vegetables are put into beers nowadays in that initial stage to help bring out some different types of flavoring. So we'll get into each of those here in a little bit, but those are essentially your 4 basic things you have to have. And in fact, in some of the older beers that were created, it was really more the starch and the yeast and the water, so hops wasn't necessarily a required factor, although you have it in a lot of things now. It is something that has taken off over time, because you did want to have that preservative, especially if you were sending out beer on long travels. So that's how that became more into play. But how you put these together actually does dictate as well how the beer is created. You have the yeast. There's many different types of strains of the yeast. You have the different types of hops that bring different things to the beer. And of course the starch source which you use, you can tell a difference between some of the grain type beers and some things that rice or corn might be used on. And as well as even water, the type of water that may be used. People don't realize how much the importance of water actually is for a beer, and it's something that gets highlighted by a lot of the breweries out there. It makes up to 90 to 95% of the makeup of the beer, making its quality of very high importance. Some like to talk about how they use some of the streams out of the Rocky, say for instance like a Coors Light. Some have other basins they use where they draw their water from. Depending on your water source, whether it's soft or it's hard, all that stuff can get taken into play when you're making a beer. So it does matter sometimes. There's some breweries that probably have to deal with getting water brought in from other type of areas if they don't have that proper water for where they're located at. So water does play a key importance. You get away from that, and then you take a look at, what about the starch or the malted grains that are used? Well, depending on how you use the grains, they bring different aspects to the beer. The color, that will actually define what the color of that beer will be. So that color of the grain, whether you're using a dark or a light, is going to determine how that beer is going to have their type of appearance. The protein, grains produce those proteins which form and hold the head. That's why you hear the importance of getting like a 2-finger head. It actually releases some of the CO2, but also builds proteins into that as well. As far as the flavor, the type of grains you may use will give that base flavor foundation of the beer against any hops that you're using, yeast, or even some of the adjuncts that might be in the mix. You have something called maltose. Well, maltose are those sugars taken from the grains for which the yeast can induce fermentation. Those sugars are the ones converted into the alcohol and the CO2, so very important there as well. And of course your dextrins, those are taken from the grains and are what help to create that mouthfeel in a beer. When you taste a beer and you get something that you know is a light body, medium, full body, whatever it may be, it's really the dextrins are the ones that are triggering that to let you know what that mouthfeel is on the beer. So when you talk about yeast, there really are only two main types of yeast. There's ale yeast, which actually ferments from the top, sits on top, takes everything from the top down, and then there's lager yeast, which is on the bottom, takes everything from the bottom up. A lot of your beers that are lager are actually done more in colder environments for the yeast to survive. A lot of people that homebrew will actually do it in the winter months because they use their garage as a place to store their beer. Your ale yeast are usually a little bit higher temperatures, of course, so you're usually between, I think, 65, 75 degrees, kind of in that range. So a lot of times when people are homebrewing, they can find areas in their home to kind of maintain that temperature. But there are many variations and strains, depending on the beer you're doing, that'll come off these two. But many people think there's all these different styles, different types of beer, which we'll get into. But really, the yeast is the only thing that determines your type of beer, and there's only two of them. So what about the flavoring or the use of the hops in the beer? Well, hops are very important. One, they bring in the bitterness for the beer. They're used to offset the sweetness of the malt and give the beer that bite you're looking for. Without having hops, your beer is going to be a lot sweeter. A lot of the lower IBU beers you have that kind of go into that porter, those stout type areas, they're lower on the hops, and you do get sometimes that sweeter type beer. Your aroma often gathered from the beer is due to the hops and are hop oils that are boiled into the beer. Now, if you're doing something where you're home brewing, you learn at a point that, if you want to get the flavor, you really don't put that in until maybe the last 5-10 minutes of a boil, because if you do it longer than that, it'll give you more bitterness, but it'll cut your flavor out. So there's ways that brewers will use hops to get that the right aroma that they want for their beer. And then for the flavor, it's not just about the bitterness. Chosen correctly, the hops can add to the complexity of the beer and bring that distinctness to it as well. So if you have a 60-minute boil and you're boiling your hops for 50 of that 60 minutes, it's going to be more bitter than if you did it for only 20 to 30 minutes. You can actually choose that pattern of how you want the hops to impact the beer. And of course, balance. Balance is a fine line. Hops are preservatives, and they bring stability and longer life to the beer. Their inclusion helps to keep away any contamination. So that's why you have the India Pale Ales, as strong and bitter as they are. When they first came out, obviously they were going from Europe to India. They used a lot more hops to keep that bacteria out of the beer. So the more you use that hops, the higher your bitterness will be. The less the bitterness goes down, obviously. So pretty self-explanatory in that regard. So going through this, I mentioned the two styles of the yeast. Well, there's really only two styles of beer, ale and lager. But when you ask the average person, they think that, there's more than two styles. No, but there's actually many types of variations. But anything you look at actually comes out of either the ale tree or the lager tree. And as you can see as displayed here, there's so many different things that come out. India Pale Ale, out of your ale area. You have some of your lagers down on the bottom that come out of the lager one, including Pilsners. So it's just a matter of all these different variations depending on how you've created that beer, but essentially it's going to be one of the two choices. But that's really the basics of the beer. So appreciate you swinging by and check out another video. If you were looking for a better understanding or some knowledge on how the beers are actually created, hopefully this does help you there. But yeah, it's if you can actually make spaghetti, you could probably make beer. It's just a matter of doing the process and being patient and letting it develop for 4 to 6 weeks or however long, depending on what you're making, and you'd have your own little beer there. So I appreciate you swinging by to check it out. Hopefully you learned something, and hopefully you found it beneficial. And if there's any comments you have, as always, please make sure you leave some comments in the comment section. Love to hear your feedback on it as well. If there's anything I may have missed or that I should have included, always let me know that too. But with that, I'll say cheers, and I look forward to seeing you on some of the other videos. Cheers.